Welcome everyone who is joining us from near and far on our webinar on the outcomes of the plastics treaty negotiation that just happened from the 25th of November to the 1st of December in Busan. Before I start, I just would like to mention that this is a webinar under the IUCN World Commissions on Environmental Law webinar series, The Transformative Power of Law, addressing global environmental challenges. And we always seek to discuss very topical, recent issues in international law and governance, and of course, the negotiations of an internationally legal binding instrument on plastic pollution, including in the marine environment, is one of these very important topics that we would like to address. My name is Christina Voigt. I'm the chair of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law and professor of law at the University of Oslo. Now, today we have with us Dr. Karine Sigwart. Karine is the Senior Policy Advisor at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and she is also the head of delegation of the IUCN to the Plastics Pollution Treaty or International Instrument negotiations. And we also have with us Dr. Alexandra Harrington. Alexandra is the chair of the WCEL task force on the agreement on plastic pollution. Now, just a very brief background, and I'm sure we will hear more of this from our two speakers, but we all know that the UNEA, the United Nations Environmental Assembly resolution from 2022 gave the starting point to the negotiations of an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including on the marine environment, and it established, or it started the establishment of an international negotiation committee, which had or has the mandate to develop such international legally binding instrument. Now, the International Negotiation Committee, or the INC, met 5 times, starting in 2022, and the hope, or at least in the resolution, the expectation was that the INC was aiming to finalize the work on the negotiations in 2024 with the adoption of such an instrument. Now, we are not there yet. INC-5 just happened in Busan. No such instrument was yet adopted, but as I'm sure we will hear from our two speakers, significant progress was made. Still, there were some stumbling stones, some outstanding issues, which of course will need to be resolved in the continuation of the negotiations. So I'm very happy to give the floor first to Dr. Alexandra Harrington, and then afterwards to Dr. Karine Sigwart. Alex, you have the floor.
Thank you so very much, Christina. Thank you to Karine for being here and for being my partner in crime throughout so much of this. It's really, at this point, we kind of can complete each other's thoughts, so it's a very good thing. Thank you also to the audience for being here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I will now share my screen and share some slides, very basic slides, just to kind of give a sense of where we are in the process, as Christina mentioned, where we began, and then kind of moving forward to where we hopefully will be going into the future. And so to take us back several steps to 2022, at the continued 5.2 UNEA Assembly meeting 5.2, which was a continuation due to COVID concerns, there was the official adoption of Resolution 514, which created the INC process, the intergovernmental negotiating process, to hopefully result in an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution, including in the marine environment, which we all affectionately call the ILBI at this point. And as articulated in the UNEA resolution, Obviously, this is intended to go beyond the marine environment, and it also was intended to be very much a life cycle treaty. So something that addresses the full life cycle of plastics and plastic pollution, including presumably the upstream measures as well as the consumer, so the more midstream measures, and finally the downstream measures, not only waste management, but also potentially things like reuse, recyclability, repurposing, all of these different ways of extending the life of plastics themselves, and the issue of what we would typically call legacy waste, legacy plastic waste, which is the already existing plastic waste that we see in our environment. The ambition for this treaty not only was very high in terms of what it would regulate, but also in terms of how quickly it would be adopted. And the ambition articulated in UNEA Resolution 514 was to have the negotiations concluded by the end of 2024, and based on 5 rounds of meetings of the INC, with then the idea that a diplomatic conference would follow for ratification, for signature, opening for signature, and then hopefully subsequent ratification by state parties afterwards in 2025. Now, to facilitate this, we've had a number of different INC meetings so far, and I appreciate that some of you have been attending these since the very beginning and are debriefing since the very beginning. So welcome again, and thank you for your continued interest. The first of these took place in November 2022, INC-1 in Uruguay, in Punta del Este. The second INC2 was in Paris in May of 2023. And I pause here just to point out that this is where we started to see an issue come to the fore. And this issue has continued to be problematic and continued to be raised throughout the subsequent treaty negotiations, and especially at INC-5. So this is why I want to mention it here. And that is the issue of the rules of procedure. And the rules of procedure, under the agreed upon rules that were adopted before the November negotiation session started, reflect the standard UNEA and UNEP rules, which typically would promote and provide for consensus, however, also provide as an extreme measure in a case where a very small group, for example, of states would otherwise block what everyone else was typically agreeing on in terms of moving forward with either a treaty itself or with a certain provision, to have a vote called and to have a majority vote be used in that context. This was very controversial, and a group of states very much opposed this, and it sent the Paris meetings a bit off in terms of timing. So we then spent almost 2 days talking about this. And ultimately, there was a decision made to place a note in the official record from INC2, which is continually read in each of the subsequent INCs at the opening, pointing out that the states were not unified in their view on the application of this, and that this is bracketed, which means that there is no agreement on it as a way forward. We then held our first INC3 in November 2023 in Nairobi, which was the first one that featured a zero draft, so an actual draft negotiating text, which was then refined a bit to reflect everything that was said in Nairobi in April 2024 in Ottawa, during INC4, where we used what was called the revised zero draft, which had grown to approximately 70 pages. And then ultimately, what was called the compilation document was released in advance of INC-5, several months in advance, and that had grown to 77 pages and was reflective of everything else that was added in Ottawa in terms of draft treaty text proposals. In the interim, coming out of Ottawa, we had the authorization for intersessional work, which had been proposed previously but not agreed upon. And this was held in August 2024 at the meeting of 2 ad hoc open-ended expert groups in Bangkok, as well as prior sessions online, which focused in one room on financing and financial mechanisms, and in the other room on chemicals and product design and plastic products. Both Karina and I were there as expert representatives from Sao Tome. This was a very much expert-driven and nominated process, so we were able to participate in those rooms as well. At the end, there was very little consensus moving forward, and that brought us into the pre-INC-5 point. And the pre-INC-5 point is where we had the issuing of the first, what we would call compilation, or sorry, non-paper from the chair. The compilation document was authorized at the end of INC-4 by the INC itself, and so that was created by the Secretariat. But the feeling of the chair was that at 77 pages, this text was very unwieldy to use to try to have a proper negotiation that could potentially give us a treaty at the end of the Busan meeting. And that he had found, after meeting formally and informally with the heads of delegation and others involved in the process, he had found a potential way forward to at least agree on a framework or a potential framework convention that would allow us to ratify, hopefully start ratifying something into the future, have the diplomatic conference, and clarify a great deal at the first sets of conferences of the parties. This was issued at the end of October, and it was proposed to be used as the negotiating text in Busan. This caused a great deal of debate during the opening of the INC, and many states were opposed to this or opposed to the use of the non-paper without the ability to have the compilation document or other textual proposals come back in. So as a result, we saw that we did start with the chair's non-paper, but we also had everything open up again and a great deal more textual proposals were made. Throughout the week, and I know Karine will talk about this more, but throughout the week, there was a great deal of deadlock between states and between alliances or groups of states that had been forming previously. This included a number of references to and concerns regarding the use of consensus versus the use of the voting procedure, as we talked about for Paris. And so to try to facilitate the way forward on both the 29th of November and the 1st of December, so the last day of the negotiating round, the chair issued additional non-papers, which we typically colloquially refer to as 29th November and 1st December to differentiate, trying to articulate ways forward based on what he had heard and what he had seen as textual proposals. Ultimately, however, by the early morning of technically the 2nd of December, there was no agreement reached in terms of treaty text. And since only 5 overall negotiation rounds were authorized under the UNEA resolution, there was an agreement to adjourn until a time and date to be specified later in 2025 for what we will call an INC 5.2. And 5.2 will be a continued session where the chair will pick up the gavel. He will then open again, and we will continue the negotiations. There are still a number of things that are outstanding at this point in the sense that we don't know a location, we don't know when. There were some requests for parties that this be very quick, so within the next, say, 3 months, because the feeling was that we needed to have momentum continue. Other states felt that we needed to have a much longer period, so 6 months at most, perhaps 8 months. The location is very much a question. And then there is a bit of a question as to what iteration of either the compilation document or the non-paper will be used as the basis for the next negotiations. A number of states objected to the use of the December 1st non-paper. Several also objected to the use of the 29th of November non-paper, and some again objected to the use of the initial non-paper. So we will see very much what happens. It's an open question at this point, which does make it a bit difficult to provide analysis and insights moving forward as to what to expect when we move on in the negotiation rounds. But at this point, I think what we will do is turn to Karine, have her do a very interesting presentation on what IUCN was doing there, and then we'll come back for kind of final thoughts and wrap up. So Karine, I will stop sharing my screen as I hopefully can remember how to do properly. And then why is this not letting me stop sharing? Or Roberto, if you can just stop. There you go. Thank you. Roberto is always there to save me from my technological foibles. Thank you, Karine.
So thank you so much, and most welcome also from my side and from headquarter in Gland in Switzerland. And thank you so much for this opportunity to give some insights also from the policy side of the things. Thank you so much, WCEL, to let me speak also. And we have such a great cooperation, and you will see it also in my slides. So please, next slide. So I think it's really worth, Christina did it, and also Alexandra did it, that we recall what is in the mandate, because the mandate for the plastic treaty negotiation is quite interesting also with regard to the scope. It's quite broad. We have, Alexandra mentioned in the full life cycle approach, and you will see that this is quite important, that we recall every time the mandate. In the mandate also is the inclusiveness, means the stakeholder participation, quite a strong component, and also the circular economy approaches are quite strong components to the outcome of a treaty. Please, next slide. So perhaps also just recall what are the objectives of IUCN, not only at INC-5, but throughout the whole process. We have two IUCN resolutions from the Marseille World Conservation Congress that gives us a strong political mandate from the Union. And on the other side, we have the objectives for the INC negotiations is to influence the negotiations in line with the IUCN resolutions, but also in line with our mission. And this means that we try to incorporate the nature and biodiversity aspects in the future treaty. Secondly, but also we have to be aware, once the treaty is adopted, IUCN will have a key role as a player in the implementation of the treaty. For example, with the methodologies and the criteria data, and especially also the support for national action plans, but also for the national legislation, for capacity building, monitoring, and so on. And this is also relate to IUCN's projects and policy work. I have mentioned here especially AfriPac. This is with 5 West African countries that we are supporting in the negotiations. I think Alexandra mentioned this. It's also EPIC, it's the Island Plus project, but also IUCN Plastics work globally. We have more than almost 12-year experience on the ground on dealing with plastic pollution, and have developed specific methodologies also to analyze where are the lacks also in legislation and international treaty law regime with regard to overcome the plastic pollution crisis. Ahead of INC-5, IUCN, World Commission on Environmental Law, and the Zoological Society of London, as well as Fauna and Flora, both are IUCN members. We developed a brief and also a one-pager on biodiversity aspects within the future treaty. And this was a great collaboration, showed also how important it is to rely on this experience that IUCN has on the ground in order to advance the biodiversity issue in the global plastics treaty negotiations. Please, next slide. We were again a small but a diverse delegation. You see some photos here. We are from the Secretariat and the Ocean team, but also with Alexandra from the World Commission on Environmental Law, and also from the regional office from Africa. We were present in Busan, and you know that only there is a strict number on delegation. We are allowed to bring in 5 people, and not more, but we have been supported remotely by Secretariat colleagues. Alexandra had also the specific role to be part of the legal drafting group. I think perhaps she will tell us a little bit what happened there on behalf of the Guinea-Bissau delegation. And so we had also some insights in what is happening in the country, deliberations and decision making. This was at that time quite important, because starting on day 3 of the negotiations for the access for observer was really limited in the negotiations, because they were taking place behind closed door in an informal setting, but only negotiators had access to this. So it was interesting to have Alexandra in the Guinea-Bissau delegation also for that reason. And our colleague from PACO, from the regional office, Alima Koite, was invited from the Senegal delegation to take part in their group, and also, for example, in the African group deliberations. And I think for the future, it is interesting that IUCN can, I don't want to say play, but it's a little bit also strategically taking over of this capacity that we have as a union to also cooperate very closely with some country delegations. Next slide, please. We have, because we hadn't that much access to the negotiations, we had a strong role in several side events, and you see here some of them. Alexandra, especially also on the topic of subsidies, for example, this is quite important, and on our biodiversity article or reflections, we had also a side event that was quite interesting and had really good feedback on this. Please, next slide. So when we have a look at the outcome, you see again this on the right side, this word cloud, and you see that biodiversity still doesn't play that role that it should do. Although that some countries brought in some textual proposals, and especially also Kenya, for example, mentioned that it's important to have biodiversity mentioned in the treaty, but so far it's still really missing as a key element. It's neither in the preamble, neither in some other text, neither in as a standalone article. We don't have biodiversity so far in the text. It's also clear that the future plastics treaty must be science-based, and as the mandate from UN resolution says, address all phases of the plastics life cycle. This means including production, as there are some countries, and they are not that much, I must say, they want to focus only on downstream and waste management measures and make almost everything only voluntary, on a voluntary basis. And this means also that we have to have strong intersessional work, and that also stakeholders with expertise means like IUCN and the World Commission on Environmental Law, we should be there. We had the opportunity to make a written statement on biodiversity and health. We had a little bit a closer look if we could go on a One Health approach. And it would be interesting also to listen from you with your legal expertise around the world, what in the future plastics treaty could be done with a One Health lens. And we try to reflect this and make a proposal, and we will see if it will be taken up. Please, next slide. You have here some quotes from an IUCN blog we have done just after the session. Director General Grete Aguilar, Alexandra Harrington from the World Commission on Environmental Law, and myself, we really mentioned that the Union is here also to help to bring forward this treaty, and we hope that we have a strong treaty in the future. And this treaty must also include biodiversity and what we have seen, indigenous people's rights in the text. You see on the right side a photo from indigenous people standing up for their right to speak, because this was quite difficult for observers to get the floor during these negotiations. And finally, they got the right to speak after a longer debate, and this is not what we are expecting for, because we also reflected on the latest COP16 decisions on the Convention on Biological Diversity, where indigenous peoples got their proper committee to be included in the decision-making process of the Conference of the Parties. So a future treaty on plastics should also give them the right for the minimum during the negotiations, but especially also in the future treaty, the right to have their place and voice recognized. Next slide, please. So what were the critical points, not only from a legal, but especially also from a political standpoint? You must be aware that we have different coalitions in these treaty negotiations. We have those from countries, and I have the example of the High Ambition Coalition, but you have also the like-minded countries. I didn't find a website from them, but the like-minded, this is Russia, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iran, and others. And you have also the scientist coalition, but also the business coalition. So a future treaty must to bridge a little bit these different coalition interests and also voices. So we have seen that the full life cycle approach and circular economy is still something that also from a legal standpoint needs some clarity in the text when we are talking about the scope and the objectives of the treaty, because full life cycle, this can mean extraction, from extraction till disposal. It could mean from production till disposal, and some are arguing it's only from waste management that we are talking about. And so we will have to see how to deal with this. The member of the European Union, the lead negotiator of European Union, he said that this new MEA, this plastic treaty, is something new also from the concept of international environmental law, because circular economy is something that is quite broader than only have a section of environment dealing with the chemical like Minamata, or with one part of the process like Basel Convention on Waste. So we must be aware that when we are talking about the new plastics treaty, that it's quite broad. We have to address the impacts and the effects on biodiversity, but also climate change and people. We have the human rights and human health and just transition aspects to reflect accordingly in the treaty. But what is really important at the end is the coherent and the convergence with other international treaty regimes and instruments. And I think Alexandra will talk about this also, what are our ideas behind this. But saying also the stakeholder involvement, this goes also with the coherence and convergence and cooperation with other treaty regimes and organizations, but also the role of the private sector is still disputed. And then obviously the financing, like in other under treaty regimes. And what Alexandra already mentions is the governance and the rules of procedures. But what came up also now is, what are the other possibilities? Could we think about a treaty outside of the UN system, and what will be the options continuing under the UN system? So these are a little bit the legal policy and scientific questions around the chair's non-paper now. And I'm really curious also how negotiators will deal with this. Next slide, please. So what we are doing, we will continue our work, and the focus is in particular on the biodiversity aspects, but also the indigenous people's rights, that they are considered in the agreement. We will host further specific webinars. We will develop scientific and legal briefs. Thank you so much, Alex. This is great work, and we will obviously also participate at INC-5.2. And I thank you so much for this opportunity to give you a short insight, and I leave it now to Alexandra to wrap up and say what is on stake from a legal side. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Karina. And I know that we're almost out of time, but I just wanted to go through quickly, at least on the invitation that I had, it said to 2:30, but I'm hoping that we have a little bit more time. Okay, no, that's fine. Good, excellent, good, lovely. So I think to expand a few things, first of all, the legal drafting group, which Corinne mentioned, was something that I didn't want to raise in the beginning because it gets a little bit confusing. It was authorized, as is often the case. For example, we saw in the chemicals, the global framework on chemicals, etc., is authorized as a more common practice, typically of having a smaller group of legal experts who will represent states technically, but be there to do things like clean text, make sure that there is coherence between various terms within the treaty, and that the terms that are ultimately agreed upon make sense from an international law perspective, from legal perspectives generally. With this in mind, at the end of INC-4 in Ottawa, there was the agreement to create a legal drafting group for INC-5. And the idea was it wouldn't meet until INC-5 because there would be no text to clean until presumably INC-5. And it would be comprised of nationally nominated experts, legal experts. Typically, these are very small bodies. They are very expert-oriented bodies. However, what we saw early on was that this became a bit more political, in the sense that when the full list of people nominated came out, it was approximately 102. So much bigger than we would usually expect. The ask had been that each country only nominate one expert. However, this was quite clearly not the case. So we had some delegations with 9, with 6, then we had some with 1. So we did have a number of people in that room. I was quite fortunate to have been nominated, as Karine mentioned, by Guinea-Bissau to be their expert on the legal drafting group, which was, again, a result of the AFRIPAC work that we've talked about in previous INC discussions and post-INC debriefings, but continues to be quite relevant. It actually will be much more relevant now, even more, moving into the INC 5.2 period, because there is such uncertainty as to what it will bring and also what resources will be available for training, etc., that it really will be a critical way of training and helping the countries that we're working with. And as a reminder, those are Cabo Verde, Sao Tome and Principe, Guinea-Bissau, Sierra Leone, and Senegal, to participate actively in the negotiations, as they have been doing. But as one of the designated legal drafting group experts, I had one entire meeting of the legal drafting group. We had one. We were convened in about Wednesday, so halfway through, to have a discussion as to what the practices and procedures would be for the legal drafting group, should it have occasion to meet. And at that point, it did look questionable. And we did not ultimately have an occasion to meet again, because there was no decision of any of the plenary meetings to send us text to look at. So many people were joking that it was a lovely holiday in Korea. Certainly it wasn't. There were many other things going on, but one of the open questions at the end of the INC-5 meeting and at the adjournment is actually the status of the legal drafting group, because it was authorized in Ottawa and our mandates were for INC-5. But there was no qualifier of only INC-5 in Busan. There was conversely no extension of all INC-5 iterations. So it is rather unclear to us as to whether or not there is an intent for us to remain as such and for the nominated experts to remain the same, or whether there will be a new legal drafting group created for INC 5.2. So that is one thing that is, I think, very much up in the air, and we do need to hopefully get some clarity on, I'm assuming, in the new year, after everyone takes a bit of a rest. One thing also to point out from Corinne's important discussion on biodiversity is that we were actually able to see a much more active role for many of our countries that we work with in the AFRIPAC project, including Guinea-Bissau, not only in terms of negotiating, nominating people to be their representatives on the legal drafting group and speaking in the negotiations, but also offering textual proposals. So Guinea-Bissau took up our textual proposal that we had put forward between IUCN and Fauna and Flora, and actually made that as an in-session textual proposal Ultimately, we will see what gets reflected in whatever document we're using, but that was at least offered. And it was offered by them as an indication of how important biodiversity is, especially to small island developing states and to coastal communities, et cetera. So it truly was both for us as IUCN, but also for Guinea-Bissau. It was a very important moment. We have seen, as Corinne also thought that I would come back to this, and indeed I would like to. We have seen an increasing and very dynamic role for the idea of regime convergence, the idea of how we discuss other treaty regimes in relation to the plastics treaty. And part of this is necessary because this will be such a broad treaty. It was envisioned, and I think the idea that UNEA convened the negotiations for this to many indicated that it would be an MEA, a standard MEA. However, what we know now is that it is such an economically driven topic that it is much more of an economic treaty, or will be, than, for example, Minamata, because Minamata was such a niche area with mercury in comparison to plastics. We know that it has a great deal of public health overlap and overlay, not only in terms of trying to prevent plastic pollution, but also the arguments for using plastic in many ways, which come to us from the public health sphere. And many of the proposed exemptions, to the extent that there are exemptions, are based on public health concerns. So this is truly a double-edged argument. We also know that this will impact on trade. We know that it will impact on, for example, subsidies, and we know that it will impact on human rights, indigenous rights, et cetera. So it really is considered now to be a much larger treaty than what we would think of as a standard MEA in many ways. This has brought up the argument of regime convergence, and sometimes this is being done quite positively, to say that we need, for example, to retain an article on international cooperation so that we could facilitate future COPs and future secretariats working with the governing bodies of other treaty regimes, for example, CPD, UNFCCC, the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions, et cetera, to coordinate on topics that overlap. The other, and perhaps more negative view, which was brought in typically by the like-minded countries coalition, is that if there is any regulation internationally in a related sphere, so for example, trade under WTO, or any aspects of waste management by the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions, that this should be used to explicitly then remove those provisions from the ambit of the treaty regime, out of concern that there would be an overlap and create some type of hierarchy that might not be favorable to existing international law. And this is an argument that continuously has been raised, but especially in INC-5 was quite prevalent. And we saw this in particular in the contact group discussions on chemicals and product design and plastic products, when we saw the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions come up a great deal. Also, any trade restrictions, typically it is a very Russian-led argument, but it is an argument that the World Trade Organization should be solely responsible for hearing anything for trade, even where we have other examples from CBD or from BRS, where there are existing trade-related regimes which have functioned quite well. So that is something that will, I think, continue to be a very big issue as we move into INC 5.2, as will the voting issue. And the voting issue is something that keeps getting addressed to a certain extent and then kind of put off. And this is not uncommon. I mean, we have seen this actually happen with Minamata for all of its conferences of the parties. There is yet to be a resolution of this on Minamata. So it's not uncommon, but it does get to be an uncomfortable question when there is a potential for a number of states to want to have a vote in the future. And we have seen this happen in the plastics context on the last day. So on the 1st of December, when the High Ambition Coalition and associated countries, so over 100 countries, had a press conference, were very active in saying that they wanted to have the treaty regime move forward as a high ambition entity, that it was now the majority of states wanting this. And also during the closing plenary, making similar statements, giving rise to also the question that Corinne mentioned about what will happen if we have future stumbling and roadblocks. And so there is a feeling amongst a number of countries that they might want to perhaps go outside, and certainly those in the non-international law world who don't understand some of the intricacies typically keep raising questions of why don't we go outside the UN system, and why don't we have something that would be kind of much more open, for example, like an Aarhus Convention or something that would be much more open to states that want to participate. And then if you want to come and join later, that would be fine. Obviously, there are a number of legal intricacies with that and issues in that and also in relation to the NEA resolution. But these are a number of the issues that keep coming up that will continue to come up during INC 5.2. So I think we have a great deal of work cut out ahead for all of us. Of course, a good break is always an important thing at the holidays, but we will, as Karine mentioned, we will continue to do intercessional work. It was not authorized at the end of INC 5.2, 5.2, so there will be no official meetings like we had in Bangkok, but that will not stop certainly many people, including IUCN and WCL, from providing additional expertise and additional spaces for various questions to be addressed. So we are planning events on that. The legal briefs will certainly come. I actually have a pile on my desk that is behind the newest one, which is looking at the multiple iterations of the non-papers. So kind of charting what went into each one and where we see the trends and where we see some legal issues that have carried over continuously and are kind of ingrained in the process at this point. And then obviously 5.2, whenever we have information on it, we will be happy to share it with you and get your inputs. But I would like to open up now if we do have any questions, rather than just talking the whole time. If we do have,
well, maybe I can come
and
in.
please, Christina, please do.
So please, thank you so much for sharing your impressions and your expectations. I just wanted to say we do have the full hour for this webinar, so we have left on some 20, little less than 20 minutes left. So for the audience, please use the Q&A function to put in some questions. I'm sure there must be burning questions out there. But while you think what you can ask Alexandra and Karine, let me ask you a question, and you can decide who wants to pick up on that. As you said, Alexandra, there's now the realization that it's a complex issue. It's much wider than just the usual MEA focus, but it does remind me very much of the climate change complexity, and you've been in that world as well. And there, the only way forward to forge a new, consensus and treaty-based regime was based on the idea of nationally determined contributions. I understand in the context of plastics, you talk about national action plans. So it's a similar structure of an international treaty to leave quite a significant of discretion to parties to put in their plans, and then have an international over element or whatever, principles and guidance on these plans. Is that from your perspective what we are going to see, how this is most likely going to move forward and perhaps resolve some of the rather significant challenges that you, Karina, outlined that are still there, and maybe even increase with the number of INCs that we have? Just from a treaty structure, what is your view is the most likely treaty design that we may see coming out of these negotiations?
We coordinate this well. I saw the little head nod. Yeah. I think that certainly it is very likely that we will see something closer to a framework as we are getting longer on in the process. And all of these lovely iterations of non-papers here all share that as well, in that they are, I think, trying to find consensus to allow us to move forward on the idea that some agreement is better than no agreement, and that we can fill out this information later. There were a number of proposals in the initial, so the first non-paper from the chair, that would have had the diplomatic conference basically being the starting point. and that after the diplomatic conference, in that period between the diplomatic conference and the first conference of the parties, whenever that might be, that we would have a sense of what work needed to be done, and then intercessional work being authorized in that context. There were a number of voices who were very critical of this, because the idea was, how are we supposed to regulate when we don't quite know what is there yet? And how are we supposed to build annexes when we don't know what is there yet? And I think from a scientific perspective, since a great deal of the focus of the binding resolution elements is on things like chemicals of concern, product design, etc., the use of a framework will continue to be a bit of a fight, because there are so many countries that feel like they don't want to make a commitment to something unless they know what they're committing to, both in terms of their abilities and in terms of what it would be in an impact on their economic resources and their trading practices. So I think that may be one cautionary point. And certainly the pushback that we heard against having a larger framework convention. But I do think that as we get closer or longer into the process, and closer towards when we thought we would have a diplomatic conference and we thought we would have a treaty, that was something that very much was clear, that we will have to have a bit more of a framework moving forward. Karine, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I think the difference to the climate treaty negotiations is that we don't have a number like 1.5 degree. You know, if we have to have the possibility to assess something, we have the only objective to end plastic pollution. And how we are doing this, we could imagine, and some are arguing like this, that you phase out some chemicals of concern in certain products, that you go down with the production. So there we would have some numbers, but it's quite difficult, because some countries are really against this kind of scope and objective with a timeline. And when we don't have this, then it's quite difficult to have nationally NDCs. It will be difficult, because we don't know how to assess the thing. And there is something where IUCN also can step in with the methodologies for assessments, because for climate, but also for CBD, we have this kind of action plans or and objectives. And for Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm Convention, we have this also. So our argument is we have to be coherent with what already exists on the ground, and make sure that this new treaty fits in there. So this would facilitate a little bit. But so far, I agree with Alexandra. Perhaps we will have a framework convention, and then step by step, being a little bit more precise. What does this mean, ending plastic pollution, and where are the numbers where we can hook it on?
Thanks. We're now getting actually some questions in the chat here. I don't know if you can see them, but the first question deals exactly with this relationship with other treaty regimes. It says that the current text from INC-5 does not seem to address this relationship in any particular detail. What is the issue? What was this issue discussed during INC-5 is the question, and can you share some thoughts why this relationship with other MEAs is currently so limited in the draft text? And then the second question is maybe to you, Karina, on exactly what could you provide some more detail how IUCN would like to see biodiversity consideration integrated in the final treaty text? And then maybe back to you, Alex, for the third question on the issue of trade restrictions. Has there been a discussion similar to the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, especially for products of concern? Floor is back to you. Maybe Alex first, then Karina, then back to Alex.
Perfect. So I think the MEAs, the focus on the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm MEAs has very much been, again, country-driven, and that argument has been raised by a number of the countries that are in the like-minded coalition, because this is a blocking technique, similarly, across various topics and proposed articles, but still a similar blocking technique in terms of there was a reference to something in Basel or something related to Basel. So we don't raise it, or Stockholm or Rotterdam. I think that at this point, there is a concern among states that are more in favor of a strong treaty about referencing a number of other existing MEAs, especially the UNFCCC, because there is a concern that some of the arguments we've seen in the history of the UNFCCC, which is quite different, could come back over, and especially in terms of issues of financing and reporting, et cetera, there is a concern about bringing that over. And so the idea is being kind of has been that no reference is a better reference in some ways. I don't necessarily think that's fair. I think it's important that we do actually address all of the MEAs together to have a coherent treaty, but I think that's one of the reasons we've seen the silence on that perspective. And interestingly, and I think Korean will have the same view on this, the need to articulate the connection with the CBD is still very much there, even for people who are involved in MEAs and their enforcement mechanisms. There is still very much a question from a practical perspective for many people as to why biodiversity needs to be in a plastics pollution treaty. So the lack of language for biodiversity and the need to kind of increase traction amongst a number of countries still is something that we've been facing. But I think it really does reflect the idea that people tend to see this more as an MEA and an economic treaty than understanding the full impacts. And obviously the trade discussions are still very much there. But the trade discussions and WTO elements have been raised, again, not strictly MEAs, but have been raised more as, again, a way of trying to deflect trade provisions from being included, and very much a blocking mechanism. Karine?
Yes, I think it's really important to see that it's quite a political discussion also, and not so legal discussion in the negotiations, because you have obviously foreign affairs negotiators there, especially, and not really the experts from international environmental law, or also, what is interesting, not really those who are in charge of the other MEAs, the Ministry for Environment, for example. And this is quite interesting to see, because uh, or is one of the reason why we don't have this kind of reflection going a little bit more forward. We had the proposal of the Philippines for a standalone article mentioning the cooperation between the different MEA secretariats and organizations. But so far, it is not reflected in the new chair's non-paper. And I think this will be something we as IUCN will focus a little bit more on it, because there are some voices and arguments in the room also, that this cooperation and convergence and coherence amongst the different MEAs and other treaty, trade law, and the WHO organization, for example, that this cooperation has to take place or happen in order that this treaty can be implemented. And the other questions regarding biodiversity, we had developed 3 options for the treaty. One is that cross mainstreaming, cross the treaty, the term environment also with biodiversity and or ecosystems where it's relevant, because in the MEA thinking, or in the international environmental law thinking, and especially policy thinking, environment means is not that specific enough in order to address also biodiversity issues. And so we had made some proposals with this regard. The other entry point is certainly the preamble. And so far, if you have a look on the chair's non-paper and also the discussion they had in the contact groups, there is no preambular language for biodiversity, which is kind strange, because in other treaties you have this kind of reference to other MEAs, especially also when we are thinking about the UN system and the UN common approach to the triple planetary crisis that has been issued so far as a really coming out of the silos, a silo approach. So I think a reference for the minimum in the preambular would be more than legitimate. And the third options that we had is the standalone article, because biodiversity is a cross-cutting issue like health. And so far we have an article on health aspects. That's a standalone article. And what we tried at the end in the negotiation to couple this as a One Health article. And there you would have the biodiversity aspects also in it, and had some textual proposal. But in any case, it will be difficult to bring this further in, although that some countries or many countries say, yes, yes, it's important. But I think really the lack is from the legal expertise where to put this biodiversity in the whole text, like it's drafted actually, in order to have something that is stringent or coherent also for implementation in the future. But these were our three options. And as Alexandra mentioned, some countries have taken over also the textual proposals, and we will help to bring this forward through the next step.
Yeah, thank you so much. It probably will be very important to find allies in this process, right? To work together with, no, I don't want to say like-minded, but with countries who share a similar position, and try to amplify voices in the negotiations. But it seems like it's a long road ahead, and a lot of work, but from what we all can perceive is that the IUCN has a very important voice in this process, the voice of nature, of biodiversity, the interlinkages with biodiversity, which otherwise probably wouldn't be carried by anyone as, as the main flag, as the main argument. So I'd like to thank you both. I don't see any further question in the chat. I'd like to thank you both for your time here with us today, but first and foremost, of course, for your dedication to this process and the time and the energy you put into this. I just wanted to mention that the legal briefs that Alexandra mentioned, they are online on the IUCN WCL website. They keep on expanding and being updated. So it's a very important resource for anyone who is interested in this process to get an update, but also get deep insights in some of the legal aspects that play a significant role in these negotiations. And then also this webinar here today is being recorded, so it will also be put out on the IUCN WCL website in due course, so it can be shared or revisited or whatever you want to do with it, to share the deep insights and information that we got today here from Alexandra and Karina. And with that, many thanks to everyone who joined us here today. Many thanks to Roberto Cole, the Executive Officer of WCL, who always works on making things look easy and smooth. And many thanks to you, Karina and Alexandra. See you soon. Bye-bye.
To you, Christina. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone. Be well.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.